In the last lecture, we looked at Hilma af Klint's The 10 Largest, a series of paintings that showed the cycle of a human life through abstract imagery. They were part of a series called The Paintings for the Temple, which consisted of almost 200 works. The Paintings for the Temple was commissioned by Hilma's spirit guides, the High Ones, as her mission to open up the eyes of future generations to the spiritual realities. These paintings were intended to be displayed in a spiraling temple that Hilma made a few sketches for in the 1930s, but she was never able to see her dream realized. However, in 2018, Hilma's work was displayed in New York City in the Guggenheim Museum, which has a spiraling inner structure, so in a way, Hilma's vision actually happened. These 3 paintings were the pinnacle of the series. They were called the Altarpiece series, and they summarized the core philosophies of the rest of the paintings for the temple. Unsurprisingly, the triangle shape figures prominently, as well as 7 colors of the rainbow, spirals, and a large golden sun or orb. In Altarpiece number 1, an equilateral triangle descends from the golden sun, which radiates its brilliance against a completely black background. The triangle is split into 7 rays, 3 each on either side of a central column that acts like a spine to the triangle. Inside the central column, 2 lines wind their way up and intersect with each other to create golden ovals. These intertwining waves remind me a lot of the snakes of the caduceus. There is another illustration which looks very similar to Altarpiece number 1, and even though the date is unknown on it, this illustration either happened before or on the same year as Hilma's Altarpiece. This illustration is from the Harman manuscript, and in Harman's illustration, there are 7 rays coming out of a black dot in the center of a gold-leaf sun with a crescent moon at the bottom. Now, W. Harman was an associate of another very famous mystic, Manly P. Hall. Hall was a mystic and spiritual teacher who revealed many of the mystery school teachings. He wrote about Kabbalistic, Masonic, and Rosicrucian teachings and gave over 8,000 lectures in his lifetime, 2 at Carnegie Hall. He was very popular. So we're not sure why both W. Harman and Hilma af Klint came up with the same image at the same time, except that it is likely that they might have been looking at a similar illustration on a theosophical pamphlet or newsletter. There was a pamphlet called The 7 Rays of Development from 1910 from the Theosophical Society, and so it is probable that they both might have been referencing that. The question remains then, what do the sun and the 7 rays represent in theosophical terms? The sun is considered the logos of the universe, and logos is a tricky word to explain because it is something akin to the word God, vast, vague, and infinite in meaning. Logos is a Greek term meaning word, speech, or reason, and it's where we get our modern word for logic from. During the Renaissance, Logos was associated with Christ as the divine word of God. I kind of see the Logos in this particular painting as the major archetype of our universe, from which all other, more specific archetypes are derived. The Logos is the logic or the founding principles upon which our universe operates. It takes an orb shape because it is whole unto itself, containing all the possibilities of differentiation which span our universe. The 7 rays which shine forth from its center are the division of the Logos into 7 more specific archetypes. Theosophy regarded the 7 rays as the 7 primordial forms of energy that come from the Logos, and stated that everything in the universe is formed by a combination of these rays. The 7 traditional planets in Vedic astrology are associated with these 7 rays: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, all the visible planets. As the Sun is associated with the first Logos, It follows that in some cosmologies, the sun is seen as giving birth to all the other planets, just as these 7 logoi shine from their original logos. Now, each human contains all 7 rays inside of themselves, and this corresponds with the 7 chakras of the Indian yogic tradition. However, there is usually one ray that dominates the person. The dominant color can be seen in the overall color of a person's aura. So Theosophy believed that when an individual begins their course of evolution, these rays are equally distributed in them, equally balanced. But as a person evolves, their actions lead them towards one ray in particular. And climbing up this ray, they must keep making progress until they have succeeded in merging their life with the Logos itself. It's another example of Blavatsky's belief of matter ascending into spirit. And in The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky describes the Logos as a bright star dropped from the heart of eternity, the beacon of hope on whose 7 rays hang the 7 worlds of being. We're going to take a look at some of the interpretations for what the rays meant. There was much literature on the subject, and in fact there was an entire book called The 7 Rays by Ernest Wood, written in 1926, I believe, in which he describes the rays in depth. However, each interpretation describes the rays a little bit differently. We're going to be looking at Charles W. Leadbeater's interpretation of the different color rays. He was a high-ranking member of the English sect of the Theosophical Society, and he ascribed the first ray, the red ray, to will, or willpower. The second ray, which was orange, he described as the ray of wisdom, which gives great teachers to the world. The third ray, which was yellow, was associated with comprehension, or those who studied philosophy. The fourth ray was associated with beauty, harmony, or art. And he says this of the fourth ray: people who belong to this type are always unhappy until they can introduce harmony into their environment. Art counts for much on this ray. The fifth ray, or the blue ray, represents truth. And he says this about the fifth ray: the fifth ray's influence is upon most of the great scientists of the world, and people well advanced along this ray are notable for their ability to make accurate observations and be absolutely dependable where scientific investigation is concerned. So the fourth ray has to do with art and harmony and beauty, the fifth ray has to do with truth or science, and the sixth ray, or the indigo ray, has to do with goodness, devotion, sacrificial love, and loyalty. He used Jesus as an example of this ray. This is the ray of the devotional saints and mystics of every religion, he says. Now, the seventh ray, which is purple, is often associated with ceremonial magic. Now, one of the reasons Hilma might have singled out the fourth ray for her winding caduceus spirals and for the golden ovals was because the fourth was the fusion of the 3 rays on either side, and because the fourth could represent the heart chakra, which is the middle chakra in between the 3 lower and the 3 upper chakras. Rudolf Steiner, another mystic of the time who broke away from the Theosophical Society and whom Hilma was in contact with, often talked about how important it was to activate the heart chakra through meditation. I also wonder if, because the 4th chakra was associated with art and beauty, if Hilma gave it special prominence as an artist herself, if she saw herself as a kind of connector of the first and the last 3 archetypes. If the first altarpiece represents the ascension of matter into spirit, we can read the second altarpiece as the descending of spirit into matter, or maybe even the enlivening of matter by the injection of spirit. The point of the triangle, with its 7 rays of color, injects life into the gray, lifeless bar at the bottom of the painting. And from this, fiery red flames are released from the friction. In the third altarpiece, we see a close-up of the solar logos and its prismatic rays. In the very center, you can see a Star of David of interlocking gold and blue triangles, symbolizing the sacred fusion of matter and spirit. I would like us now to turn our attention to a woman known as Annie Besant. She was a devout theosophist who became the second president of the Theosophical Society in 1907, and she worked to expand the society by creating new sections in a number of countries. She traveled extensively, gave lectures, and promoted social reform, and she also wrote a plethora of books explaining theosophical concepts and esoteric tenets. She was known for her psychic powers too. If we look at one of her books from 1901 called Thought Forms, which she wrote in association with Charles W. Leadbeater, we are introduced to a series of illustrations that depict abstract, oftentimes amorphic shapes. And these strange abstract symbols represent the energetic shape of thoughts and feelings. She says that these thought forms are astro-mental images, and she says that they are energies produced on different planes of reality. Your desires and your feelings give shape to forms that are energetically heavier in nature and which stay on the lower astral plane. However, thoughts of a loftier notion also create these thought forms, but since the thoughts are purer in intention than feelings and desires, the energetic forms of the thoughts are lighter in substance and populate the higher mental plane. So there's the physical plane at the bottom, there's different levels of the astral plane above that, and then there's a higher mental plane. There's even planes above that according to Theosophy, the Buddhic and the Atmic planes, but we won't get into those today. In a way, she is saying that you may not be able to see it, but your thoughts and feelings have a concrete form in another reality, and that they operate in those realms with real effects on the physical plane. So the vibration that you give off creates a thought form which may influence you or influence another person. These thought forms are also called elementals. And clairvoyants like herself were sensitive enough to see these thought forms. She gives an example of 3 thought forms that she herself observed upon witnessing a shipwreck. She says that above the ship, many of these thought forms exploded. The most common thought form that she saw at this shipwreck was a grayish cloud depicted on the bottom right of this illustration. On this cloud was the livid gray of fear that erupted from those who were selfishly only fearing for their own safety. But she also said that she saw some clouds, like the one on the left of this illustration, that had a blue point at the top. And this blue point was created by those who feared for their own safety, but they also tried to control that fear by praying to God. And thus the blue point is going upward towards God, and blue represents devotional faith, which, if you remember, George Ennis also associated blue with faith. If we look at the form on the top, we see it is clearly defined, unlike the bottom two, because the thought on the top is full of force and resolution. It is the thought form emanating from the captain of the ship, who doesn't show fear, but he shows concern for his passenger's safety. The red downward hook of the thought form denotes anger in him that the accident happened, but the orange curve proceeding from it indicates an assured confidence that he can deal with a disaster. Let's take a look at more thought forms so that you can get an idea of the different principles that govern their visual outcome. Besant claimed that there were 3 principles governing how these thought forms looked. The first principle was that the quality of the thought determines the color. And by quality, Besant is referring to the saturation or purity of the color. So if the color is unadulterated by browns and grays, but if it is instead a pure, clear version of the color, then the thought itself is pure and of a higher nature. An example of a pure thought form like this is illustration number 8, which shows us a rosy cloud. This is the thought form of pure affection, a kind of general good feeling you get when you think of a loved one or of a happy memory. It has a hazy edge because it is not very focused and it's not a very strong feeling. And Besant said that purring cats radiate this form in concentric rosy clouds that drift ever outwards. So you can think about that next time you pet your cat. Maybe it's giving off these rosy pink clouds that you can't see. In comparison to the pure pink color of vague affection, is the thought form of vague selfish affection, which we see in illustration number 9. The pink in this case is modeled by a selfish gray in the center. Gray seems to always represent a kind of selfishness or lower nature. And the person who is projecting this thought form is thinking about what they can get out of a relationship or an opportunity. It is a conditional love, or an affection that is opportunistic. It is not selfless affection like the former illustration. Besant says that the nature of the thought form also determines its form or its shape. In other words, the shape of a thought form depends on the thought form's purpose. For example, the thought form of peace and protection takes the shape of pink wings and a golden orb at its center, as it is sent out from a person in order to bless and protect others. Honestly, it kind of reminds me of a snitch from Harry Potter. The reason why this thought form takes this shape is because the wings symbolize the protection of a guardian angel, whereas the golden orb signifies the goodness and the intellect which guides this thought form to the person that it's protecting. In Besant's third principle governing thought forms, we see that thought forms have a clear or definite outline if the desires or thoughts that they represent are focused in nature, and if they have a strong intention. We can see this clarity of outline in illustration number 24, an example of explosive anger. Besant describes this form as a vigorous explosion of irritation of someone who feels insulted or mistreated. This isn't the vague, hazy cloud of pure affection. This is most definitely a sharp and focused burst of anger. We also see this clarity of thought with illustration number 19, a thought form given off by someone who is intending to know something. This thought form is a mental thought form, given off by those who are determined to solve a problem. Besant says that you will often see this thought form floating above an audience member who is aptly paying attention to a lecturer. The more yellow the thought form, the more pure is the search for understanding knowledge. When this thought form starts to become tinged with orange, then there is a bit of self-conceit and pride tied into knowing something. But in general, Besant and Leadbeater associate the color red with anger. They associate brown with selfishness or greed, and gray with depression, fear, and deceit. Green is associated with jealousy if it is mixed in with brown. However, a pure green represents adaptability. Pinks and roses signify love and affection. Orange represents pride, ambition, or confidence. Yellow always denotes some sort of intellectual or mental pursuit. And blue is associated with religious feeling, faith, and devotion. Annie Besant's thought forms were an inspiration for many artists. The idea that thoughts were visible, tangible things, and that their forms and colors had a language that could be read, strengthened the case for abstract art, which really started in the first decade of the 20th century. In fact, Kandinsky, a Russian artist who is often credited with the birth of pure abstraction, was well read on theosophical literature, and he hobnobbed with many other artists and poets who were occultists and esoteric students. He was also intrigued by thought photography, or the idea that thoughts could be captured on sensitive plates. This practice involved directing focused thoughts at a camera, the sensitive film being able to capture the impressions of the thought forms. So, in Besant's thought forms, she claims that the nature of the thought creates its specific outline, its specific shape. Kandinsky applied this concept to his abstract art, which allowed his abstract shapes to have a spiritual meaning. Yet the abstract nature of the art was still new and revolutionary, and it broke ties with traditional European art. Now, Kandinsky believed all art had a spiritual meaning behind it, and therefore he viewed all of his abstract shapes as bearing a meaning or value. They weren't just random lines and circles floating through colored space. He dismissed the idea that there was any such thing as art for art's sake. Instead, each shape and color hearkened a specific emotion or feeling in the viewer. I'm going to read to you a quote from Kandinsky's book called Concerning the Spiritual in Art, in which he talks about art, music, and literature being a revolutionary force for spiritual revitalization and cultural change within society. In this quote, he uses the word form, and by form he just means shape, whether it's a triangle, a circle, a square, or a squiggle. He says, "Every form in the world says something, but its message often fails to reach us, and even if it does, the full understanding is often withheld from us. Properly speaking, form is the outward expression of this inner meaning." The inner meaning of the shapes allows art to have a power that imprints the viewer's soul in a lasting way. Kandinsky says that colors can have a profound psychic effect on those who are sensitive enough to feel their effect. So a work of art can cause the soul of the viewer to vibrate with it in correspondence, much like a tuning fork. And Kandinsky says this is partially due to the nature of the shapes, but it's also due to the power that color holds. So I'm sorry guys, but we're back to color symbolism because it seems like every artist in the early 20th century had an opinion about what colors meant. Like every other artist, Kandinsky associates red with flame or fire, which he says is attractive to humans for its warmth. And he says, "Red rings inwardly with a determined and powerful intensity. In music, it is a sound of trumpets, strong, harsh, and ringing." Kandinsky had grown up in the aristocratic circles of the Russian elite, and so he was well versed in the history of music, as well as the revolutionary classical music that was happening during his time. Kandinsky himself played the cello, and often named his artworks after musical terms like composition. Music and painting were interchangeable forms of art to him, and colors were often compared to instruments, while his paintings were seen as symphonies. Within his color correspondences, Kandinsky describes yellow as the typically earthy color, which can never have a profound meaning. And he describes blue as the typically heavenly color. Therefore, the colors retain much of the same symbolism as during George Inness's time. I think this quote by Kandinsky nicely sums up what I'm trying to say about color and form. He says, "Color is the keyboard. The eyes are the hammers. The soul is the piano with many strings. The artist is the hands which play, touching one key or another to cause vibrations in the soul." So in summary, we can say that whereas Besant viewed these abstract forms as being given off by people's mental and emotional bodies, Kandinsky believed in turn that art could use these abstract forms to impress its audience members towards spiritual growth and enlightenment. So it went both ways. The forms were given off by people, and the forms could impress certain states into people. When we look at Kandinsky's work, we get the feeling that he's employing multiple thought forms to create a complex and moving composition. It feels rather difficult to pick out any one form and directly link it to Besant's thought forms. However, we know that his reasoning behind creating these thought forms had much of the same theory behind it as did Besant's thought forms. I would like to mention one of Kandinsky's associates before we move on to our last painter for this lecture. Franz Marc was one of Kandinsky's close friends and a co-founder with Kandinsky of the group called the Blue Rider Group. This group was short-lived, much like the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but it aimed at extolling the spiritual nature of art. And Franz Marc was a German painter and printmaker, mostly known today for his paintings of uniquely colored horses. However, he echoed many of Kandinsky's sentiments about art's true purpose, and he also borrowed theosophical concepts from Besant. This is apparent when you look at his painting Fighting Forms, completed in 1914, which seems to be two thought forms playing out the global chaos that preceded World War I. The mass of red whipping around on the left is the painterly form of some of Besant's thought forms that deal with anger, such as murderous rage, explosive anger, and angry jealousy. This mass of red shatters the colors behind it into cubist fragments, and it reaches out with angry red claws, much like Besant's thought form of selfish greed. Behind the red whirlwind, a black tidal wave subtly devours the colors into its void. Franz Marc said that this painting was a premonition of war that had something shocking about it. He also wrote, "Furthermore, the hour is right for such a confrontation, since we believe we are now at the juncture of two long ages. Everywhere ruins remain, old ideas and old forms which refuse to vanish. Even though they now belong to the past, they linger on like ghosts, and a Herculean task faces us. How can we dispel them and so make room for the new which is already waiting?" Franz Marc saw the Great War as a struggle between the materialist and the spiritual forces, and he said the spirit can tear down citadels. This quote is typical of many artists, of many social reformers and anarchists, and of many people during that time who were calling for reform and change right before World War I. Artists and many other social progressives were actually excited for a war to start. They thought the war would be short and quick and would overturn the decaying aristocracy of Europe and in the materialistic greed they associated with modern society. They didn't realize the war would drag on for years, killing millions, and sinking into a stalemate of trench warfare. But there was much change in terms of revolution and national boundaries. New countries broke off from each other at this time, new republics were formed. The Russian Revolution swept power from the old aristocratic families as Russia became the Soviet Union. And ironically, Kandinsky, who was also in favor of a war in order to, quote, end the nightmare of materialism, unquote, his aristocratic family was stripped of their land and their wealth during this time. Kandinsky, however, was sympathetic to the voice of the people. His co-founder of the Blue Rider Group, Franz Marc, who was also so ready for war, enlisted with the military and was killed by a grenade near Verdun in 1916 at the age of 36. The last artist I would like us to take a look at is Agnes Pelton, a painter who lived most of her life in America, and who thus feels isolated from all the European turmoil, despite the fact that she lived through World War I as an adult. She was born in 1881 in Germany, but moved to New York as a child. Much of her adult life was lived in a hermetic existence in the desert of the western United States. She eventually ended up in Cathedral City, California for the last 30 years of her life. And Agnes was a formerly trained artist who received her education at the prestigious Pratt Institute in New York City. When she moved further west, she supported herself by painting desert scenes and by selling them to tourists, although sometimes that provided only enough money for her to survive at the barest level. But besides these tourist paintings, she made beautiful, symbolic, visionary landscapes. These paintings were much more meaningful to her, and that's what we're going to take a look at today. Pelton's paintings seem to be a mixture of landscape painting, of theater, of the surrealist dreamland, and of theosophical and esoteric systems. She described her paintings as windows into an inner realm rather than an outer landscape. This notion was indicated by the theatrical curtains that framed either side of the canvas, creating a staged experience for the viewer, as if you're looking in on a dreamland. And we can see this in her painting called Incarnation from 1929. In this painting, we also see the Rosicrucian rose, which we previously saw in Hilma af Klint's work. This time, instead of the rose being in a wreath, it is illuminated and floating above a bubbling and pearlescent imaginary landscape. Agnes said of her work, "Sometimes the view is peaceful, even complete calm, or it may be active and stirring. But there is no semblance of material things or substances visible here except when a symbol materializes into the language of named things." And Pelton was very interested in the way that symbols could capture the power of the subconscious. She was interested in Carl Jung, and through her paintings she tried to explore her subconscious, the deep and hidden part of oneself that you couldn't actively communicate with. It was only through dreams and trance states and symbols that this part of the psyche revealed itself. Pelton once copied in her notebook a quote from Carl Jung, in which he said, "Symbols always express superior insights or qualities that are not yet conscious." Some of the most common symbols she used were stars, flowers, and mountains, and you can see traces of the natural world in her paintings, such as in the painting Stargazer, in which we see a naturalistic-looking bud expanding into a luminescent vase that receives the outpouring of starlight from above. Stars immersed in twilight are a common theme in her work, as she was a firm believer in astrology. And she also copied symbols from Besant's thought forms. For example, in this work titled The Primal Wing, the wing should be instantly recognizable as a derivative of Besant's thought form of peace and protection. It wafts across the page like a cloud in the sky over an icily still lake. We also see in her painting Resurgence a jabbing point of ultramarine that almost pierces a flickering star. Commas of yellow and red float around the blue base like thought forms reverberating. The blue point itself is reminiscent of Besant's shape called Upward Rush of Devotion. And Besant says of this shape that the person who emits this thought form shows conviction, courage, and utter selflessness. The way that Pelton's spike of blue aims itself at the star can also be correlated to Besant's idea that a person who devotes themselves to reaching for the higher realms of God is answered by God. In this image, she says that a person who has conviction and devotion can pierce the upper realms like the mental and the astral realms that we were talking about before. And when they pierce these upper realms, the light of the Logos floods the individual through the channel that has been opened. So Pelton's Resurgence seems to be a much more beautiful expression of this notion. Her painting called The Voice is also reminiscent of the thought forms of music over cathedrals. Besant gives several illustrations of how different musical compositions look to the clairvoyant, from Mendelssohn's linear cloud to Gounod's plumage of colored shapes. Gounod, by the way, was the composer that wrote Ave Maria. Pelton's painting The Voice also speaks to an auditory experience, and it echoes the unfurling shape of the music found in Gounod's thought form. Sometimes, Pelton just seems to riff off of the visual imagery offered in the book thought forms. She doesn't always use their actual original meaning. For example, in her work called Light Center, we see a glowing egg that has fine filaments of light weaving around its edges, and it seems similar to Besant's thought form called the appreciation one feels when one is looking at a picture. But the nature of the title, Light Center, suggests that this painting has a completely different purpose than Besant's original thought form. The overall image suggests that Pelton is reformatting the thought forms for her own purposes. Sometimes her paintings seem to be an amalgamation of all different kinds of thought forms, as an interval from 1950 and Focus from 1951. But Pelton had many metaphysical interests besides Theosophy and astrology. She practiced meditation regularly, and she studied Agni Yoga. But Pelton had many metaphysical interests besides Theosophy and astrology. She practiced meditation regularly, and she studied Agni Yoga, a spiritual discipline that based itself on the alchemical benefits of fire, and how spiritual fire could purify the soul. We see her fascination with fire in works like Mount of Flame or Fires of Space. No matter the inspiration, Pelton explored the invisible powers that enlivened everything, from flora and fauna to the vast geological processes, to weather, and also to the forces that enlivened the human subconscious. Agnes Pelton was just one of the many artists who was influenced by Annie Besant's Thought Forms book, and by Theosophy in general. All of the artists we looked at today celebrated form and color as holding symbolic spiritual significance. They gave creed to abstract shapes that wandered away from realism in order to create a new visual language, the language of abstract art.